Are you good at routines? How about following instructions? No? Well, sometimes I'm not either. Sometimes I like to do things without reading the instructions and figure things out for myself. Do you know someone like that? My name is Ian Currey and this is Thinking Out Loud. Today I'm thinking about how to get good at something. Does that just happen? Or do you need to follow instructions and practice? Come on, let me tell you what I think. Not very long ago, I had to have a medical test. I expect many of you can guess what that was for. In my job, I've been tested regularly to make sure I'm able to work safely. Well, I'd done these things so often that I decided to just click and post without reading all the fine instructions. Okay, so it was a new system, but how hard could it be, right? Well, I waited and waited for my name to be called and nobody called for me. I waited some more, but still nobody called Ian. In the end, I went to the office and asked why I wasn't being called. And the very nice nurse there asked me my registration number. "Ah, there you are," he said. "This is Atlanta. You've managed to register in Los Angeles, and they're probably looking for you over there right now." Well, you'll be pleased to know that the nurse managed to fix my mistake and get me sorted out. He was very nice about it, but while he was correcting my mistake, he said with a big smile, "You know, a lot of people are doing things like that. You have all the information you need. We even ask you if you're sure, and you still manage to book into a clinic far, far away." That reminded me of a passage in 2 Timothy, and I'd been reading that just recently. I'll show you what I mean later. There's a second part to this idea, though. Sometimes in our house, one or other of the boys would ask a question, one of those questions that I would decide not to answer. I would say something like, "Well, what do you think the answer might be?" Or, "Come on now, use your brain. You can figure that one out." What I was really saying was that they had all the information and all the skills they needed to solve the problem that they were facing, and yet somehow didn't seem to see it. Somewhere in the many hundreds of pictures we have of life at our house is a picture of Cody putting together a chest of drawers. We carefully followed the instructions and he did all the work all by himself. I was totally proud of him. Now, I could have jumped in and helped or pushed him aside and done it much faster myself, but that day there was no need to be the fastest or the best. That day the need was to follow the instructions and develop a skill or two. Long after, Cody could be heard telling his friends, yeah, I made that myself." So he too was very proud of his achievement. Robert's different, and we found a few pieces of old wood in the garage and put this together. There were no instructions other than in my head. This was one of those do-it-yourself and figure-it-out-as-you-go projects. Now, both scenarios have something in common. Both boys were following instructions, actually, and using the gifting they have. Cody was a little more able to figure things out, but wasn't so organized, while Robert had fun making sure everything was in a straight line and organized. The skills they used were very different, but together we managed to make something in both cases that was useful. Both were using the abilities they had and the personality they have in a way that contributed to the end product. Now about Timothy. Let's take a look. 2 Timothy chapter 1. I remind you to fan into flames the spiritual gift God gave you. So apparently spiritual gifts are something similar to woodworking projects. Once you start using the gifts you have, you get better at it perhaps. You have everything you need, you just need to use it and figure out how it works. That's fanning into flames. Talking about spiritual gifts in the same way as talking about making a bedside table might sound strange, but somehow that seems to be the way it works. Look again at 2 Timothy, just a little bit further down the letter Paul is writing there. This particular part is often quoted as a "you can do it" thing, or perhaps a shout of encouragement. Don't be afraid, get on with it. For God has not given us a spirit of fear and timidity, but of power, love, and self-discipline. I think mostly I've heard people focus on that power part, or not being timid, and sometimes saying being powerful is the opposite of timid, perhaps. But as an electronic engineer or an electrician, I see power differently, perhaps than most. Power in this verse doesn't seem to me to be standing up as a superhero and flexing my muscles, but more like connecting to the power supply. Plugging in, if you like. You see, the very next word is love, and that is something that defines God, isn't it? So I thought of this verse in this way. 3 parts. God's available power, the effect on us when we connect to it, love, and that third part that is so often missed, self-discipline. Figure it out. Use your brain. That part is another way of saying fan the flames. Look, you've plugged in. The love of God is available to you, and that's available to share, but you have to get on with it. Paul is encouraging Timothy not to be timid Timothy, or ashamed, as the very next verse says. So never be ashamed to tell others about the Lord. Now, the gifts that God has given you may be very different than He has given those around you. The way others use the skills and gifts that they have has to be to the best of their abilities in those areas. And you may be gifted to do something very different indeed. Some of the things I've done and perhaps got reasonably good at, of course, can be considered gifts from God. But just because God gave me a mind that can figure things out and make things work doesn't mean I can just not bother to fan those skills into life. So many things change all the time, don't they? In a couple of videos soon, I'll be showing you an old radio I salvaged from where it probably should have ended up. My friend gave it to me and it's been salvaged from the rubbish pile. That project has taken a lot more time than I usually have patience for with old radios and things, but this one was a challenge I just couldn't turn down. Now, the parallel is there. With that old radio we will be looking at soon, I could only do anything with it because I was able to use a wide variety of skills that I've consistently and constantly had to hone and keep sharp. When I was in college the first time round, Wi-Fi wasn't invented yet. And without constantly returning to study, I would be left with a very dusty skill set that would be of little use these days in those areas. Of course, the basic skills, logic and certainly physical science and the principles there are the same. And God gave me a brain that works in the kinds of ways needed for those things. But without me fanning it into action all the time and keeping the clutter out, it would soon be rather dull and useless, wouldn't it? How are you developing your skills? And what about your spiritual gifts? Are you fanning those into flames? Do you regularly draw power from God's power supply? And how do you demonstrate God's love using your particular gifts? Now, these are rather big questions all at once, aren't they? The very first thing, though, is to read the instructions rather than always figuring things out on your own like I did with my medical test. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it helpful perhaps. The radio rebuild we will look at soon seems like an interesting project. Let's see what we can learn from that one. Go ahead and post a comment below. I'd love to hear how you're using your gifts. Until next time, goodbye.